Alrighty. Okay. So obviously that whole documentary, it's a little bit hyperbolic and obviously a little bit stylized with those, family sections, the dramatized kind of portions being meant to sort of drive emotion. I think it does an interesting job in a couple of ways, right? Of really bringing forward people in the tech industry to talk about the problems of social media and how, especially its capitalistic focus rather than potentially its humanistic focus on profit at all costs leads to these companies that ultimately, extract value from us as human beings, and, may not be acting in our best interest or the best interests of, human flourishing or democracy or any of those things. So here, I do want to dig in now to a couple of arguments because actually, the arguments presented about social media in a lot of ways are historically bound with a lot of other sort of technologically determinist and I think slightly dystopian notions about what technology does to people, right? And so, we saw that at the beginning of the course really with Postman, right? We're talking about the history of youth and childhood at the beginning of the course with Neil Postman, right? And he's talking about how the printing press fundamentally transformed, medieval society from, basically an oral society to one based on print, and how that ultimately played out into the formation of different social categories, different forms of social organization, more individualism, a bigger divide between the public and the private. And so, I kind of want to go back to that argument for the second half, to do quickly kind of the second half of his argument in The Disappearance of Childhood, which is all about television. I know, we talked, the documentary is all about social media, and we're going to go back to TV and a book that Postman's writing at the beginning of the 1980s about television and how it's transforming the minds of young people in particular, right? And the kind of whole society. And then, we're going to go forward to social media, right? And the smartphone and kind of take a look. And I think these arguments in a lot of ways are of a similar kind, right? That our technologies fundamentally, in a lot of cases, transform us. And Postman's from a particular school of thought called media ecology that views kind of, the technological landscape and the media landscape as an ecosystem, right? And then basically his contention is, once you introduce a new technology into that ecosystem, it's a whole new ecosystem, right? And so we'll see that argument kind of played out when he talks about television, and then we'll go on to talk about social media, because right now, there's a really heated debate going on around smartphones, around social media, and their effects on particularly young people. And the final kind of thinker we'll look at in the course is Jean Twenge, and she's kind of, along with I think Jonathan Haidt, is on kind of the bleeding edge of this and really advocating against social media. And just this kind of this weekend, there was a big editorial in the Washington Post where they basically defended social media, and they said, we don't have enough evidence to know what social media is doing to people, so we're just going to have to wait for the evidence. And Twenge wrote a rather scathing response to that, which I'll talk about next class, saying, yeah, actually we do know enough about social media and its effects on young people, and something needs to be done about this, really quickly. Now, will there be something done? I think I am not optimistic on the whole, because these companies are so powerful, and people love them so much, right? If you ask, people where they spend their time, a lot of it now is spent on, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or some other social network, right? Or social media network. So, all right, let's jump into kind of Postman's argument. We'll do a little bit of Postman, and then, we'll take a break and kind of end off with Sherry Turkle, and we'll kind of go from there. Unless I change my mind and decide to do Twenge first, in which case I'll do Twenge first. I keep switching these around every time I do this course. I might switch it as I go through this and change my mind. So I apologize for that in advance. Okay, so if you recall, right, we kind of followed Neil Postman's argument at the beginning of the course. He talked about the transformation that came, from the printing press, right, especially with regards to the concept of the emergence of childhood. And he kind of takes us to, the 19th century, where this concept that we would kind of recognize as childhood had kind of fully emerged, right? And through into the 20th century, in the middle part of the 20th century, so from about 1850 to about 1950, Postman thinks of this as kind of the golden era of the concept of childhood. And again, he's constructing childhood very, very broadly as a kind of social category, right, between 7 and kind of 17. So the second part of the book sort of picks up in Postman's sort of dystopian notion. And Postman very famously was I think, tech pessimist. Many of the books he wrote were about how he thought, unbridled kind of technology. And especially, he wrote a book called Technopoly in 1998, 1999. That was all about how technology, and specifically the technocratic mindset that technology could solve every human problem, ultimately was going to be our undoing, that we'd surrendered our culture to technology at the end of the day. But in the 1980s, he was mostly concerned with what he saw as the deleterious effects of television on the minds of young people. Okay, so he suggests that, what kind of happens around the late 1950s, early 1960s, I guess it had been coming for a little while, right? But basically, it was the end of what he calls the monopoly of letters. So he thinks this kind of starts, initially with the photograph, right? The photograph, comes in and really starts to be part of things like newspapers in, the end part of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. Prior to that, what you had in newspapers a lot was lithographs, drawings essentially of things. But photography comes in, in the 20th century. And then, more and more kind of visual media enters the fray in, as the 20th century goes on. You get film, right? The cinema, and then television, and then obviously, more television, right? If you go through the 80s, you go from the 3 broadcast networks in the US, and then I think there were 2 in Canada, and then to cable television, right? And hundreds of channels. And then obviously the internet and things like YouTube, right? Which is a lot of visual media. And basically what Postman argues is that gradually pictures came to dominate the world and sort of displaced print in really major ways. And I mean, one of the kind of quips he has in the book is, a picture may be worth 1,000 words, but it's certainly not the equivalent of 1,000 words. But that basically it has a sort of, the image has a sort of visceral power to move people, especially with regards to emotion, right? People get very emotionally moved by films, by television, by pictures in ways that aren't necessary, that you don't have the same reaction often to things that you read. Okay. So why was he concerned with television in particular and visual media in general? Well, basically, one of the things he suggests is that the hierarchy that was created, right, and especially the control of information that he thinks allowed childhood and youth to kind of emerge as categories, functionally sort of collapses, right? That basically, this thing where you would kind of slowly build up a young person in terms of complexity of what they're understanding, in terms of a written text, well, that all falls apart when you have images, and particularly when you have films or television, because they are, you see everything all at the same time, right? You see, and everybody who's watching essentially sees the same thing. And television and film, they're not things that you get better at, right? You don't read them, you just watch them, and it's very passive action that doesn't require a lot from the person using them. Okay, so what are he calls television in particular the total disclosure medium. Though anything visual like images or film, are really total disclosure as well. There's a little bit more, the problem that he thinks about television is that because it's in the home, it's very unfiltered, especially for young people. Okay, so what is it about television that is, that's powerful, but also that troubles him? Well, for one, there's no grammar to television, right? And therefore there's no sequential learning, and there's no hierarchy, right? So basically, no one ever taught you to watch TV, right? Basically, you could sit down, and because it so closely mirrors kind of the eye, right? What you actually see in the world, no one ever really taught you to watch television, right? Like I never sat my 3-year-old son down and said, well, watching Dora the Explorer, okay, so when you see Dora's face and she's talking, and then you see a reverse shot and you see her talking to her monkey, Boots, that's what's called a reverse shot, and that implies that they're in a conversation, right? So they're kind of talking to each other, and you see each of them as they're talking, right? I never had to, they just intuit these things because it's a very natural kind of way of engaging. There's no grammar to television that you need to teach, right? I mean, if you're in film studies, you probably want to throw something at me and say, no, there's absolutely a grammar to film. There is, in sort of its construction, but not in a way that has to be taught, right? Everybody who's watching television pretty much knows what's going on very quickly, right? And you don't need a ton of sophistication or teaching to teach people what's going on in film. It's very natural, right? So you don't get better at it by doing more of it, right? There's really by watching 10,000 hours of television, you're not now a master TV watcher. If you had been reading for 10,000 hours, you would become a much better reader, according to Postman. And here, one of his more interestingly controversial claims, that there's really no such thing as children's television, but that everything is for everybody. And here he's not saying that there isn't programming that's geared towards children, right? That's, Dora and Sesame Street and Bluey and whatever other horrors await us. Actually, Bluey's not so cringe-inducing that I want to pull out my eyes. Most other children's television is. But yeah, and there's no such thing for him as children's television because television is just for everybody. Whoever sits down sees everything that's on television, whether it's appropriate for them or not. That the point of television is to present the same information to every single person watching it. And therein lies one of its key problems for Postman, because it fundamentally kind of does away with the concept of shame, right? The concept of shame kind of disappears. The concept of controlling information until it's appropriate disappears because anyone who has access to a TV remote can more or less see anything, right? Okay, so this is just a kind of very quick experiment. And basically, so I'm going to play you a scene from a television show that is probably old enough now that most of you won't have seen it. And basically, try to think as you're watching this, what is going on in this scene? So a couple of things. Try to think about, okay, where is it set? Like, what's happening? Pretty simple. And I'm going to give you absolutely no context. Who are, like, kind of in general terms, who are the characters and what is their relationship to each other? Like, what's going on? What's the social dynamics in the scene? And then, either we can do this by kind of raising our hands at the end, or I have a Slido slide at the end, so you can just type stuff in if you want. Okay, so this scene from a very old TV show now.
Lying in my bed, I hear the clock tick and think of you, turning in circles. Confusion is nothing new.
So just out of curiosity, what's going on? Like, I've only shown you like a few seconds. What's going on so far? Any thoughts? They're at a funeral? Okay. And what characters have you seen so far? Mom, okay. And anything else? No one will. Okay, siblings or friends. A good guess. Okay. What about, can I go back a half slide? What about this guy? Any thoughts? Any guesses who that might be? Okay, boyfriend? All right. The mom's boyfriend? A little young, but okay. We'll go with it. So friends there.
Flashback to warm nights, almost left behind. A suitcase of memories. Time after sometimes you picture me. I'm walking too far ahead. You're cold. If you're lost, you can look and you will find me time after time.
Okay, what just happened? What visual information did you get from that scene? So who's there? God, I never asked you to talk. Who is? Rainy guy? Okay. 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 What about the girls? There's brown-haired girl and blonde-haired girl. What's their relationship to him? It's a love triangle. Of course it's a love triangle, right? He's all like, and the brown-haired girl, any other information you have about her? There's one other key piece of information that's so far missing. She's with the other guy. Yes, the guy whose dad just died. Right? He's at the funeral and he's holding his mom. So again, I must play the last few moments of the scene. I'm sorry.
If you fall, I
Tom
will
forgot his
catch you.
umbrella that day.
I'll be waiting time after time. If you fall, I will catch you. I will be waiting time after time. Time after time.
By all accounts, this was a truly, truly miserable day on set. So the show is Smallville. It's Tom Welling, and from interviews, he and one of his co-stars are doing a rewatch podcast of the show, and they talked about this scene. And this was shot in Vancouver in like November, and apparently they were all freezing because they had the rain machines out, and they were just absolutely freezing to death. So a very miserable scene for him. So he looks as unhappy as he is. All right, but the point of that. You manage to, without any context, basically discern, okay, it's a teen drama, so it's not exactly Shakespeare or anything. It's no Riverdale. But you manage to kind of discern the basic relationships, right? Quite a bit of information with me providing you essentially no context. So you can see, and it's just you could look at a million different things. There's a ton of information that film and television supplies, right? It gives you so much visual information. But there is no kind of filter on it, and that's Postman's kind of basic problem, right? So how does it erode childhood and youth? Postman thinks there's no instruction needed to grasp its form, right? So I never taught my kids how to watch TV. I just plop my daughter down in front of My Little Pony and watch the hours disappear in silence. Those are good days. It makes no complex demands on behavior, right? So basically, one of the things with television, and I've talked to TV executives that basically say this is how they think of it, is you don't need to be paying a ton of attention to it, right? It's not like reading, right? If you're trying to read something and you're distracted, you're not going to take in the information very well. So don't try to listen to a podcast while you're studying for the exam for this class. I guarantee the results are not going to be great. But it makes television, you can be half watching television. I mean, I swear half the time, people are cooking or they're ironing or they're doing the dishes or cleaning up or on their smartphones while they're watching TV, right? It's something that you can sort of half pay attention to in a different way. And text is something that's quite different. And particularly for Postman, it doesn't segregate its audience. And he draws this again as a difference from print media. And he gives the example of a book that was very popular when he was a young man. I mean, Postman was born in the 30s, so we're going back a ways. But I think it was in the 1940s, a book came out called The Tropic of Cancer, right? And this book was very famous at the time for how salacious it was, right? Lots of sexual details supposedly exposed in the book. It was banned, in New York where Postman lived. It could not be sold to minors, but Postman managed as a young man to get his hands on it at a secondhand bookstore. And he said that he tried to read it and could make absolutely no sense of what was going on, right? That it was, in kind of complex language or language about, I've never read it, but, it was describing sex in such a way that it didn't really make sense. And now compare that, say, to something like, any show you see on television, or even like, I was gonna say Riverdale or softcore pornography, but really aren't they the same thing? Or something like softcore pornography or hardcore porn that you might find on a site like Pornhub, right? There's really no segmentation of the audience in a way that could, someone who's 10, and again, when we talked about porn, we we're talking about the concerns that, 8 and 10-year-olds are accessing pornography and they can basically understand what's going on, right? Because it's such a visual medium. And when you read something like Tropic of Cancer, it's much more coded and it's much more kind of dense and difficult for kids to understand what's going on because they don't have the reading skills to get there. Okay, some of the other kind of complaints that Postman has, right, is that television is always changing, right? It's in search of novelty all the time, right? It's these flickering images. It kind of puts away from hardcore, deep attention, and it's not well geared towards sustained discourse. And particularly in the realm of politics, he thinks this is a problem because you go from pretty substantive political kind of debates to, in the age even of radio, to, and certainly different than the age of print, to what now, if you watch I don't want to talk about the last presidential debates in the US because I've tried to blot them from my memory. But if you look at, political debates, the Canadian ones are particularly egregious examples, right? They are a collection of sound bites and politicians attempting to get zingers over on each other rather than really deep explorations of what the issues are and how the Conservative Party or the NDP or the Liberals would actually solve those problems, right? And so people are in terms of politics, are much more susceptible to, I can't even watch Canadian political debates anymore because it's literally just the candidates trying to talk over each other and it's gall and nothing gets said. It's galling. Okay, yeah, and television has this insatiable need for novelty, right? That you need something new all the time, right? Because it's always in search of the next thing that's going to keep your attention, right? And this has become kind of hyped up in the internet era, right? Where, hitting, like they said in the documentary, hitting that refresh button is meant to bring you new content to keep you engaged on the platform as long as possible so more ads can be sold. Okay, and yeah, television, and I think this is his kind of principal complaint about it, and I think of all visual media, the internet included, it opens secrets, right? But has no way of limiting its audience, right? It has no kind of filter on it. Now, you could put age filters on, when we talk about television now or Netflix or things, they're relatively easy to get around, but it's a little bit better. But certainly, like once you have access to content, there's really nothing blocking you, right? Yeah, you had to reach a level of skill to read adult books. Now on television, everything's just accessible all the time, right? So if you found something, far too mature on YouTube as a young person, or on television, it's all there for you to see, right? There's nothing kind of filtering it because it's all visual information. Okay. So Postman says that television, and God, Postman dies in 2003, bless his heart. I think if he'd lived to see the real ascendancy of something like YouTube, he probably, would not have enjoyed that particular moment in human history. But basically, right, what he says is that television makes it almost impossible to keep secrets from children, right? So all of those things, and he blames here a lot of things like the TV news, right? TV news, which is just kind of blaring all of the secrets of the adult world all the time and is accessible to anybody who has a TV remote, right? Especially, he lived long enough to see cable television, particularly CNN and the beginnings of Fox. But it's always kind of broadcasting all the secrets of the adult world to everybody. And so he suggests that shame kind of disappears, right? Nothing is hidden anymore. And so you no longer really have to worry about giving children information and whether they can process it, because nothing is hidden, right? There's no, do you have to censor talk about money or politics or religion or sex from children, because everything is being broadcast all the time. And people noted, and Postman was among them a little bit later than this book, that things like the Bill Clinton impeachment trials, right? So when Bill Clinton essentially sexually harassed and probably sexually assaulted some of his interns, particularly Monica Lewinsky. Bill Clinton was a president of the U.S. I don't know how much you know about American political history. He was the president of the U.S. basically until 1999. So I try to remember the exact years. 1993-ish, 1994 till no, not sorry. It got to be 1992. 1992 till 2000, essentially, when George W. Bush took over. And one of the things that marked Clinton's administration is that he basically sexually harassed and then sexually assaulted one of his interns, Monica Lewinsky. And then, it was sort of brought to light. He was impeached and sort of brought to a trial in the Senate. He was not convicted and not kicked out of office, but it was broadcast everywhere that, essentially he'd gotten blowjobs under the desk in the Oval Office by this White House intern. And so, this was blasted out on cable news for all the world to see, including children, right? Including pretty much everyone. It was all over the place, right? There was no shame. People were talking about the white stain on her blue dress and all of these sorts of very salacious details. And it was just all out there for everyone to see. And so what Postman says, right, is that these new technologies, things like television, but we could say this for social media, for smartphones, for all of these, the internet in general, he calls them a Faustian bargain, right? A sort of, deal with the devil. So, I mean, if you know, and hopefully you do, it's a fabulous story, the tale of Faustus. It basically, Dr. Faustus makes a deal with the devil to have kind of limitless human knowledge, and he trades his soul for it. So he gets limitless knowledge, right? He knows essentially everything, but his soul is ultimately given, to Satan. It's a German kind of late medieval, early modern tale. And Postman kind of thinks this is the same thing we have with technology, right? It's a deal with the devil. You get something. Television gives you entertainment. It gives you instant access to news and a very visual way of seeing the news, which in a lot of ways is transformative, right? Like I said earlier in the course, there's a lot of kind of historians who think that one of the reasons that Vietnam was such an unpopular war was because people saw it on television, right? They saw the images of wounded soldiers. They saw, Vietnamese villages burned out on television. So it gives you something, but he thinks it also sort of takes something away, right? And it makes it impossible to keep that dividing line between adulthood and childhood really thick and well defined. So he thinks that you get a kind of blurring of that line at the end of the day. Okay. Oh, sorry. I changed this a couple of years ago, I guess. The picture's the classic one. So what do young people see on television according to Postman, especially on TV news? So the adult world is a really immoral place, right? It is a place of crime, of corruption, of guys in funny hats invading the US Capitol, right? Adults are basically pretty inept, right? And now that's true. Adults are most people are pretty inept, myself included. People make mistakes, people screw up. The world is a much less regulated place than we tend to think it is, and people are much less competent than I think we wish they were. Adults kill each other, right? They see war, they see crime, they see killing, they see murder, for all sorts of reasons. Because you got tired of your wife and wanted to marry someone else, but the only way to get out of, paying, spousal support was killing your wife. All sorts of murders happen for reasons like this. Basically, they see that adults are not moral, ergo they have no real moral authority, right? That a lot of the things that adults tell young people about, how you should conduct yourself is false, right? That basically they have no moral authority, and therefore the transmission of morality gets really, really difficult. And yeah, all of this was always true, right? And there's nothing new about this in the TV era. We had our Donald Trump figures prior to television, but mostly you could only find out about them, using reading skills, right? You read about them in the newspaper or in a book rather than seeing them broadcast on television. So what Postman sort of argues is that as, his notion is childhood disappears, adulthood is also kind of disappearing in its own kind of interesting ways, right? So, what he says is, print emphasized, all of these adult traits: self-restraint, delayed gratification, right? Because you had to sit there. If you wanted to get to the end of an argument or the end of the book, you had to sit there at delayed gratification. A sophisticated ability to think conceptually, not for everyone, obviously, but for some people. And then hierarchy, the value of hierarchy and reason. And he thinks these things get undone by television in major ways. And basically, he suggests that what kind of emerges is what he calls the adult child, right? Basically, the person whose emotional capacities are not that different from a child. And I think, I don't want to be as definitive as Postman, because I think he probably goes a step too far here. But, I think it's not a coincidence that as these technologies really come to maturation, we start talking about, like Arnott in 2004 puts out the concept of the paper that talks about emerging adult. Is this a new life stage, right? As kind of technology, as television and then the internet starts to really come into its own, we start talking about the emergent adult or emerging adult as a new social category, right? And is that maybe this phase of the adult child? I think Postman would say yes. But, I don't think we have to be that definitive about it, but it is an interesting thing, I think, to think about. Okay, a couple more things with Postman and where he thinks that television has had a deleterious effect on kind of the minds of adults in particular. So, in terms of the voter, one of the things that Postman claims, and I think this is obviously true, is that the notion of what's called a Jeffersonian democracy, right? The democracy that was sort of founded in the United States, of whom one of the real architects was Thomas Jefferson, was predicated on this idea that if people are going to vote, they have to be informed in order to do so, right? Basically, the informed voter was key because people had to know what they were voting for. You didn't want people who are uninformed and foolish ultimately to be making decisions about who runs the country. That, in principle, is why children are not allowed to vote, right? Because they're not fully formed adults. They don't know enough about the world to make good decisions. And so they could easily be manipulated, I think, by different kinds of emotional arguments, especially. And so the idea behind a Jeffersonian democracy, right, is that you gain skills through literacy that you need to make informed decisions. And people are supposed to lay out complex arguments, and you choose between what you think is the best path. Now, Postman thinks that democracy really breaks down as the image takes hold, right? Because it becomes about who looks best and who sounds best or who appeals to people's emotions the best, right? And I think, he uses a bunch of examples. I'm trying to remember if I have them I don't have them on the slide, but I'll just mention them in passing. One of the really famous examples that's often held up of this shift to the more emotional or the more visual is the debates that were held in 1960 between John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. So basically, this was the first time that a presidential debate in the U.S. was televised. And according to the story, and there's some historians that kind of dispute this a little bit, but I'll give you the story as it's normally kind of told. Kennedy was, a good-looking fella, and he was someone who kind of understood television for whatever reason, right? And so he showed up to this debate and, basically had them apply makeup, right? Because you look really gross under the camera lights if you don't put it on. Nixon didn't have any makeup applied, and supposedly he wasn't feeling very well that day. And basically, they went on and they did this debate, and, Kennedy was kind of suave, good looking. He was made up, right? He had the makeup put on, and Nixon kind of looked sweaty and uncomfortable and out of place. And basically, as the story goes, is people who watched the debate on television thought Kennedy won, right? But the people who listened to it on the radio thought that Nixon won because his points were more substantive, which has always been held up as a kind of idea that, once you enter this visual medium, image matters much more than necessarily ideas do. Now today, I think we're well into this, and hilariously enough, how to put this, out of let me just think, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, and Trump, essentially 2 out of the last 6 presidents have basically been, Reagan and Trump, or it's 7 if we count Biden. 2 out of the last 7 presidents, if we count, basically starting with Reagan and then with Trump and his 2016 win, were basically, a movie star and a reality TV star. And why was their appeal so strong in lots of ways? Because their image was really powerful, right? Trump, for all of his foibles, and he has no end to the list of them, is definitely charismatic and definitely knows how to use television, right? And I mean, I think of maybe hopefully you've blotted out of your mind. I remember the debates, one that he had with Hillary Clinton. They were both standing on a stage, and Trump would just kind of follow her around the stage, standing behind her and looking huge, like he was dominating over her, right? And this left a very powerful and visceral impression in lots of people. But none of it was about, certainly, especially when we are talking about Donald Trump, about policy or anything like that, right? Because, it was all about image and how you felt about Clinton and how you felt about Trump. And the following election was all about how you felt about Trump and how you felt about Joe Biden, right? It was a very emotional thing. It stopped being about policy in lots of cases. Okay. I got 2 more slides here, I think. So other things that Postman kind of points to, and I think things have gone so much worse since Postman wrote. He talks about, especially on television, what he calls the disappearing child, right? And basically, he's talking about this in the 1980s, but suggests that, children have all but disappeared from television by the 1980s, right? Well, if you looked at the 1950s and 60s, you had shows like the one on the top, that's a show called Leave It to Beaver, where basically you had kids that needed adults to help solve their problems. Now, fast forward, and he suggests that by the 80s, right, all of the kids on TV essentially have adult problems and sort of adult personalities. But I mean, fast forward even further to the 2010s and a show like Riverdale, which I'm sorry, I just can't help but chuckle. One of the things that my wife and I have been doing since the show came out is hate watching it. I was hate watching it last night with her. It was quite fun. But anyway, the children on Riverdale, to put it lightly, are not children in any meaningful way. They're not played by children, for one, right? All of the actors, even when they began, were all adults. I think KJ Apa is like 28, which is hilarious because right now on the last kind of season of the show, he's back to playing what's supposed to be a 16-year-old Archie Andrews. And it's hilarious because I swear to God, he looks like 40. It's like, I can't take this seriously in the slightest, which is probably kind of the point. But all of their problems, right, are about adult things. They're constantly solving crimes and, saving the town, and all of these things, right? Not the things that you would typically associate with a high school student. So, the kids have, in a lot of ways, kind of disappeared from television, right? A lot of kids, even on television, are adult in some way. Okay, I think, yes, that's my last slide. Even in media representations, he also suggests that essentially what you see on television now, and again, he's writing in the 80s. I think this in some ways has gotten a lot worse. He calls the adultified child. Now, TV's changed a bit. You have more serious dramas on TV now. The 80s was dominated by sitcoms. But in sitcoms, right, you still see characters like Phil from Modern Family, right? And I think this description sort of fits well, right? With few exceptions, they don't take their work seriously if they work at all. They're kind of children. I won't read the whole quote from the book. But basically, someone like Phil Dunphy on Modern Family is essentially a child in an adult body. And there's lots of scenes you can pick from. I couldn't find any good clips from it. I wish I could. They really scrub YouTube of Modern Family clips for whatever reason. Probably copyright stuff. But, there's a lot of characters that are basically at their core kind of children in function, Okay. It's not my. There's a couple other things I do want to mention. I think I took it out last year. Other things that Postman mentions in terms of kind of the. Maybe I'll go back to the adult child for a sec. One of the things that he does mention is two things, I guess, that are important. Taste and entertainment. Postman tied, again, in the 80s, the rise of superhero movies strongly to this adultification, or sorry, this childification of adults, right? The fact that superhero movies were so popular was like the fact that the adults never grew up, right? That basically they still loved their children's entertainment in comic books, even when they were adults. And the rise of fast food, especially kind of the burger joint, he also ties to the fact that, it used to be that, hot dogs, burgers were for kids, right? And soda were for kids. And kind of through, the period of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, they became kind of all the time foods for adults, right? And things that adults consumed constantly, leading to the rise of kind of the fast food industry. And one other kind of minor point in terms of children acting more like adults and that line blurring, the semi-professionalization of children's sports. And I don't think you have to think too hard about it to see that, if you played hockey as a kid, or kids who are playing hockey now, how professionalized kids hockey in Canada has become, right? Basically, at this point, I've heard my wife's cousin's kids play hockey at quite a high level in Calgary. And, they were basically being pressured by the coach of the team that they shouldn't go on their normal 6-week holiday. Because it's like, look, if your kids aren't in hockey camp for those 6 weeks, they're going to fall behind, right? They have to be working on their skills all through the summer at hockey camp. So there's a lot of pressure to adultify kind of children's sports. Okay, we'll stop talking about Postman and move to something a little bit more contemporary here. Okay, why don't we take a 20-minute break? We'll come back at 2:40, and we'll go for about another hour. We'll talk about either Turkle or Twenge. It'll be a surprise when you get back. I'm still deciding which one I want to do. Maybe I'll do Twenge because I think that one will lead into the last topic a little bit better. So we'll talk about Twenge today, but take a 20-minute break. Yeah, come back at 2:40. And then we're going into our last little bit here. So we got two kind of shortish units left, and we'll be easily done by kind of middle time next class with lots of time for review and questions if you want. All right, so we'll see you in 20 minutes-ish. That's dying. Interesting. Alrighty, let's get back to it here, and we'll get through as much as we can. Okay, so the last couple parts of the course obviously are all about technology. So here I want to go back. I talked about her a little bit at the beginning of the course, which is Jean Twenge and her book iGen. Oops, you know what? Those are notes from at the end of last term, which, because I reused the slides, I forgot to clear off, which I will do now. And they were making fun of me for saying broadly speaking too much. My students are jerks. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Okay, I can't fix it. So, because it's not rendering properly. Weird. All right, no worries. We'll just go with it. You can see the comments from last term. That's fine. I can't reset it without closing PowerPoint. Okay. Okay. So who's Jean Twenge? So Jean is, like I said at the beginning of the course, professor of psychology at San Diego State University. I mean, she really hits the mainstream, and now, I mean, if you're looking at like the psychology circuit, right, in terms of major speakers being brought in all over the place, she's everywhere, right? My wife went to a conference on learning and the brain in San Francisco in September or October, I think. October, I can't remember exactly. And Twenge was one of the big speakers there. Everybody's kind of after her time, specifically because of this book, iGen, that she wrote in 2017. Yeah, I mean, again, she kind of cut her teeth talking about Gen X in her dissertation, then went on to trash millennials in two books, The Narcissism Epidemic and Generation Me, and then iGen. And just like at the beginning of this course, I'm still working my way through it. It's a little drier than I was hoping. She wrote a book called Generations, where she kind of catalogs major generational differences, starting with the silent generation and moving through until Gen Z and what she's calling the polars. So that would be younger than born after 2012, essentially 2010, 2012. Okay, so this book, the one I'll kind of be pulling arguments out of, is her 2017 book. So it's already 6 years ago, which seems crazy to me. Book iGen, really, really interesting book, and obviously you can see the kind of subtitle of the book. Why today's super connected kids are growing up less rebellious, more tolerant, less happy, and completely unprepared for adulthood. And this is where the book kind of made huge, huge waves. And this, I think, is the second edition of it, because on the first, I can tell the difference between editions of this book, because in this edition, the iPhone has no home button. On the first edition, it had a home button. So they redid it. Okay, so again, I know that we saw this already earlier in the course, but basically, why did she call it iGen? She's now kind of given up on it. She calls them Gen Z like everybody else. But basically because, this is the internet generation, the ones who were born and raised basically with technology. Well, not with technology, that's a stupid thing to say. Every generation's had technology, whether it's the wheel or something else, but with internet technology, right? Smartphones and kind of pervasive internet access in particular, right? And for even the youngest amongst Gen Z, the internet has always been pretty available, right? Commercially, it becomes available, where you can get it in your home at pretty low cost, somewhere around 1996, 1997. The youngest of Gen Z are born in 1995, right? Okay, so it becomes more pervasive starting in 2007, right? The internet goes from being something that you have at home or at school to something you carry around in your pocket, essentially with the invention of the iPhone. But one of the dates, and if you remember all those mental health slides I showed you, from Jonathan Haidt, and a lot of them in collaboration with Jean Twenge, all had a big black bar at 2012. This is the reason, right? By 2012, about half of Americans owned a smartphone. More teenagers, right? If you looked at teenagers, in 2017, that should be 2017, it was about 75%, and 18 to 29-year-olds was about 94%. So essentially, in a 5-year period, starting in 2007, ending in 2012, the smartphone became a ubiquitous possession for most teenagers. Okay, now Twenge is quick to point out that not all, the smartphone, like anything else, has its good sides, it has its bad sides. And one of the kind of bad, good sides that she points to is that in a lot of ways, the smartphone did what other inventions, really had struggled to do in making the internet really pervasive, and erasing, for the most part, what we call the digital divide in Canada, the US, and most of kind of Europe. Basically, it used to be that, if you were wealthy and you could afford high-speed internet at home, you had high-speed internet at home. But for people of lower socioeconomic class, it was a little bit dicier having the internet, right? It was something that you couldn't necessarily afford. And so a lot of people, had to access the internet in public spaces, coffee shops, libraries, and these sorts of things. Basically, what smartphones did is they essentially erased all the socioeconomic differences in terms of basic internet access, at least through phones, right? Especially once you get some actually pretty competitive phones, not from Apple, because the iPhones have tended to be pretty expensive, but Android phones that are relatively cheap, and you can buy minutes at the gas station. You can top up your internet minutes at 7-Eleven. Basically, the digital divide sort of disappears, and now, right, like one of the things she says that by 2017, low socioeconomic status youth, right, poor and kind of lower working class, spend almost as much time online as their high SES peers. Still a gap in terms of the technologies available, right? High-end laptops, MacBooks, high-end Windows PCs tend to be luxury items a little bit more, whereas, lower-end stuff like Chromebooks tends to be a little bit more available. So it's not completely even, but at least in terms of, access to the internet, it's pretty evenly spread across the board now. Okay, we went through this as well. And I still have that same typo, which I should fix. Yeah, so iGen is, for Twenge, the culmination of a kind of growing individualism that starts with the boomers and kind of has progressed. But in a lot of ways, they're showing a lot of worrying kind of mental health and anxiety markers, right? So they're more worried about safety than other generations. Less, basically fearful of their economic futures, and they're not hitting those markers of adulthood in the same way as other generations did, right? She points specifically to things like dating, getting a driver's license, greater independence. All of these things seem to be delayed, right? And so, what she suggests in the book is that, a 14-year-old today is a lot like a 12-year-old was among millennials, right? And a 18-year-old is much more like a 15 or 16-year-old in terms of maturity and kind of life experience, right? They haven't gone through as many things. Now, again, you don't have to see this as good or bad, right? I think she tends to frame it as worrisome, but the fact that, fewer Gen Zers date might not necessarily be a bad thing, right? That they have less sex might not necessarily be a bad thing either. A lot of this is sort of left up to, I think, the individual to kind of interpret what it means. But the pattern seems to be, less mature, less life experience at roughly the same age as their, as their older peers, right? And again, have sex later, less frequently than past generations. We talked about that when we talked about sex. You know, but just in general, right? Less ready to go out into the world, despite the fact that a lot of the kind of age-related things that people are supposed to do, right? Like figure out life course and go to university and figure out what you're going to do with the rest of your lives haven't changed, right? So you have potentially less mature people, you know, moving through the life course, according to Twenge. Yeah, and I mean, I think what I hopefully established pretty clearly in some of the other material, right, especially when I talked about mental health, is that there is a kind of deep mental health crisis kind of, I was going to say brewing, but actually it seems to be kind of upon us, especially when it comes to Gen Z girls. But, you know, it's not like the boys are doing particularly well either, right? So again, they're physically safer in some ways, right? That I suppose is a good thing, right? They smoke less, they do less drugs. And especially at young ages, I think I've said before, that's a good thing because your more problematic patterns of substance use will tend to emerge when people start using substances at young ages. Drink less, right? They're less likely to drive hazardously. They're less likely to drive at all. Hard to drive hazardously when Mario Kart is about all the driving you get to do. Less likely to get into a car driven by someone intoxicated. They tend not to be in places where people are intoxicated, so that helps. Less likely to be murdered. I'm defeated. This thing is invincible. Right, and less likely to get into fights, get murdered, get harmed. They're supervised more, right? 75% of the time, their parents know where they are and who they're with. You know, pop an air tag in the bag and you know where they are all the time. But yeah, given less independence, and less likely to do things that in past generations were fairly normal, like going home from school on their own. Okay, I'm gonna clear these off. They're now annoying me. Okay, all right, so I have no idea what those comments are referring to. Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that's pretty clear, right, and the reason that 2012 is that bright line for Twenge and for Haidt, is because principally of the way young people are using their time, right? It's all about time use and where your time goes. And basically, one of the things that's true of, I mean, it's increasingly true of every generation, but it's especially true of Gen Z, is that their time is characterized by less time spent with each other and more time interacting with devices, right? So, I mean, okay, this contributes to their physical safety, right? Because if you're on screen at home on a Saturday night instead of at a party, you know, you're not going to get drunk and get into a fight or get assaulted or sexually assaulted or any of these kinds of things, right? You're not going to get into a car with a drunk driver because you're at home watching Netflix or something. Probably YouTube at this point, actually. You know, or playing Fortnite or Rocket League or something like that. Maybe you're on with your friends, you know, on voice chat while you play Rocket League, but still, you're very, very safe. And they spend less time doing a lot of things that are especially associated with good mental health, right? So they spend less time volunteering. We already established, right? We talked about jobs. Gen Z is working less than their peers did at the same time, and their older generation peers did at the same time. They spend less time doing homework. Maybe this is just my complaint. My 13-year-old daughter seems to do almost no homework. And I'm like, man, I had so much homework when I was in junior high, but I should talk to my parents and be like, did I have a lot of homework when I was in junior high? And maybe they'd be like, not nearly enough. I only ended up with a PhD, so I'm sure I'm a disappointment somehow. My parents had very high standards. I think they're still happier that my sister is an engineer. She's like, well, I mean, you have a PhD, but it's in sociology. Couldn't it have been something useful? Okay. Thanks. My parents have actually said this exact phrase. Honestly, like, well, your sister's an engineer. I'm like, okay. All right. They spend less time playing sports and less time attending religious services. Right. We talked about this in terms of religion. Right. The Gen Z and later millennials were less religious than any generation in the past. Okay. So now that said, they have more leisure time, right? About an hour and a half more than millennials did, and they spend most of that on some kind of device. And here obviously, and we saw this all through that mental health kind of unit, right? Depression, suicidality, self-harm are all skyrocketing amongst this generational cohort. Okay, and this is, sorry, the thing to note here, right? This book was written in 2017, so this is a solid, 4 years before, I guess 3 years, 4 years. She probably wrote it in 2016, so I would say 4 years prior to COVID. So we're not even seeing in this the COVID effects. Things got so much worse during COVID because all of those trends were accelerated by isolation. Okay, so one of the things that has tended to be true, and Twenge notes, of Gen Z is that she suggests that they're less, they desire being adults and maturity and those markers of adulthood less than older generations did. She particularly compares it to Gen X, but millennials as well, right? In surveys, they were more likely, and some of these are longitudinal things like monitoring the future, right? So surveys that have been running since the 1970s, where they ask the same kind of questions. They're cross-sectional longitudinal studies, but they ask the same questions to various, young people as they kind of move through the life course. And one of the questions has to do with would you, if you could, would you like to stay a child? And the number of young people have said they'd like to return to being a child, especially offloading the responsibilities of adulthood has increased, right? She suggests, here, I've never experienced this, she suggests this from her anecdotal evidence with her students at San Diego State University, that she felt like her students wanted to be really spoon-fed, right? They wish that they didn't resent being treated like children. They wanted to stay children longer. And this one, and again, a little different. I haven't experienced this as much because, again, U of A is a different kind of school than San Diego State, and American colleges are weird. You leave home to travel to a distant city in most cases to go to an American college. Canada's a little different, right? We tend to commute from the same city. But one of the things she suggested that she's noticed that change from her millennial students to her Gen Z students is that they're in constant contact with their parents. And she has a few anecdotes in the book about basically being in conferences with students, discussing their grades and helping them with essays and such. And, they're getting constant messages from their mom, or they're stopping to take phone calls from their parents, so their parents don't get too worried about them, right? So they're away at college, but texting and in contact with parents multiple times a day. Yeah, that's definitely, again, I'm an older millennial. When I left home, I had a cell phone, but there was no way I was talking to my parents every day, every week, maybe, more likely every couple of weeks. I was like, freedom. You could take our lives, but you could never take our freedom. Okay, sorry, a little Braveheart quote for you there. Bye. Oh, I would never, ever live with my parents again. Okay, love them, but no. All right, so phone addiction. Now, I hate the addiction language. I think it's overly simplistic in lots of ways, but she talks about young people being addicted to their phones. But one thing that's almost universally true, right, is that all iGeners are basically, pretty close to their phones most of the time. Losing your phone or forgetting your phone, this is a kind of recorded phenomenon of high levels of anxiety if especially young people forget their phones, right? That it's something that they have a tough time coping with. So genuinely, we've seen reports and kind of statistics people asking, where's your phone at night? Most iGeners or Gen Z sleep, with their phones by their bedside or under their pillow. And you saw in that documentary, right? I love the comment from the one guy. It's the question is not, or what did he say exactly? It's are you checking your phone before you pee or while you pee in the morning, right? That basically, and those were the two only options, right? It's generally the last thing people see at night is their smartphone and the first thing they see in the morning. Okay, so what does this look like? All right, in terms of time spent, iGeners or Gen Z, it's about 2.25 hours a day texting, 2 hours on the internet, an hour and a half on electronic gaming, a half hour in video chat. What is it? For a total of 6.25 hours a day, and about an hour and a half more if you add watching TV. Now, Now these aren't all, so that would be most of your waking hours if you actually, had 7 3/4, almost 8 hours on devices. Obviously, these are things that people are doing while they're doing other things, right? While you're in class, you're texting, or on the internet, or playing a video game. Like the first class I ever TA'd when I was doing my PhD, I sat in the back row and I watched one person who always sat in the same place play online Monopoly for the entire semester. So these are things that people are doing at the same time. Did not do well in the course, by the way. I also bought Boardwalk and Park Place far more often than you really should. But yeah, so these are all things that basically are done often at the same time, right? While watching TV, you're video chatting or chatting with people or playing games. This drives my wife crazy, and me a little bit too. My son will literally be watching TV while playing a game on his phone. It's just like, and he's 10. And my wife's like, please put down the device. His phone does nothing. It's ancient. But he still has found like some horrible old game that he can play. Okay, social media use. Again, this is 2017, and these numbers kind of stop in 2015. I think this is from Monitoring the Future. But basically, right, 87% of 12th grade girls used social media every day. So that is pretty ubiquitous. 77% of 12th grade boys, so less, right? Fewer of them are using it. Race and class differences have basically disappeared, right? So when we talk about Black youth in America or Hispanic youth in America and white youth in America, they were all roughly the same, right? There was maybe a 0.5% difference, but basically all those differences had kind of disappeared. And yeah, only 2% of 12th grade girls said they never used the technology. This is rather extraordinary, right? It's really rare in sociological terms to have an activity that basically everyone does, right? 98% of your population doing a particular activity is very, very uncommon, right? Whether that's, outside of eating, breathing, there's not many kind of sociological phenomenon that you can say that 90% or 98% of a population does. So social media use amongst 12th grade girls is a kind of extraordinary phenomenon that they're all on it essentially, with maybe the Amish make up the other 2%. I don't know where that 2% is. Probably people with parents who don't allow them to use social media, but it's very ubiquitous. Okay. And again, we saw some of this in that documentary. Social media has been designed around a series of psychological rewards, right? Sometimes referred to as like Skinner box rewards. Basically very basic rewards that are meant to give you a little dopamine hit in your brain and keep you kind of coming back to the app, right? Likes on Facebook and Instagram, likes on Twitter being the big ones. But every social media platform has some kind of feedback mechanism that kind of gives people a little bit of, of feedback in order to keep them kind of coming back to the platform. Now, this ends up being a problem, particularly, and again, you heard it in the documentary a little bit, because in a lot of ways it becomes, especially for the really heavy users of social media, which are teen girls, markers of things like popularity, right? It's markers of social status. And people start to worry that they're not getting enough likes. And so you get, people spending enormous amounts of time crafting their social media in such a way as to give themselves the best chance of getting a ton of likes, right? So girls, this is an interesting book. It's a little bit old now, but if you're interested in kind of the world of social media and particularly girls, it's a really worthwhile read. Nancy Jo Sales is a journalist, and she wrote this book basically on her research into girls and their uses of social media. There's a lot of really distressing takeaways in this book, which made me cry a little bit. But in particular, how much of teen social status is related now to social media and your ability to sort of draw people in and keep people to the point where, a lot of them feel so much pressure about it that they'd like to quit, but because the whole world of teen kind of social interaction and status is tied up, especially on platforms like Instagram, it's almost impossible for them to actually do so, right? They want to quit, but they feel like they can't. There's a whole bunch of other really distressing things, in the book, which, made me a little scared. I think I read this when my daughter was like 8, and then I don't know, maybe it's had an update, but I'd be curious about what updated research says. Things like, teen boys in particular, requesting and then storing and passing around nudes of girls that they get, right? Comparing almost collections of what they've been able to acquire was one of the more distressing things. The way that girls now ultimately feel like they have to sexualize themselves on Instagram, and a phenomenon that I had never heard of, but apparently it was fairly ubiquitous for a while, maybe it still is, was the butt selfie, where girls would prop their butts up on the bathroom counter so they could get a more Kim Kardashian-ish kind of look. All sorts of things driven by social media and a lot of sexualization, particularly of teen girls, but also opening themselves up to a lot of space where they could be shamed, slut shamed or body shamed by virtual strangers. So image cultivation has a dark side. Okay, so girls versus boys. Girls spend more time on social media. Boys tend to spend more time playing video games, right? Especially computer, like PC and console-based video games. Competitive ones, right? I mentioned, Call of Duty, Rocket League, Fortnite, these sorts of things. Boys are not outside, with their friends, kicking around a soccer ball or whatever used to be wholesome back in the day. They're mostly playing video games. In 2000, it's hard to get like really good numbers on it. In 2015, it was about an hour and a half compared to about an hour in 2008. Everything got scrambled during COVID because gaming went crazy. But it's a lot, right? Oops. Girls are playing more games as well. It tends to be different games, more kind of mobile games, more puzzle games, less of the like rocket. Again, there's not that girls don't play things like Warzone or Rocket League or Fortnite or whatever, but they play it less. 9% of teens, mostly boys, reported playing 40 hours a week or more of video games, which is, basically the equivalent of a full-time job. Okay, so why does this matter, right? Leonard Sachs, I think, gives a really interesting explanation of this. In that, how to explain this? Social media for girls tends to be all about trying to get popularity, trying to get likes, and trying to get affirmation, right? Which can be really difficult. It involves a lot of things like crafting images, using, I can't remember what the name of the software is, like Facetune or something, to edit images, putting filters on so that they feel like they look better, right? To give the most, taking hundreds of pictures to get the most flattering one, maybe trying out dozens of outfits, all these sorts of things, right? All in search of likes and easily susceptible to, people making negative comments. What Sachs suggests is that video games are a little bit different in terms of what they tend to do is give boys a sense of accomplishment, right? So, one of the things that tends to be true is that as you play video games more, you get better at them, right? So if you pick up whatever the ubiquitous game is right now, if you play it for a bunch of time, right? You put hundreds of hours, maybe thousands of hours, who knows, into a video game, eventually you're probably going to get pretty good at it, right? You're going to hit, and the games are designed in lots of ways to give you kind of feedback on how much you've improved, right? So, I started playing Rocket League, I guess probably about a year ago with my son. As we've moved up, right, we started in bronze, we leveled up, we were silver for a long time, and we both finally made, we're terrible, but we both finally made platinum over the weekend, right? Which was a huge accomplishment for my son. There was dancing, I think he almost cried at making platinum. And, he's now like twisting up in the air with his imaginary car, getting aerial goals and all sorts of stuff. And he feels a real sense of accomplishment about it, right? It gives him a dopamine hit in a positive way. He's like, I'm good at something. He gets this sense of self-efficacy from playing these electronic games. And that's a more positive experience than constantly searching for social affirmation via social media. Getting that sense of self-efficacy, and it doesn't matter, right? Any game you play, as you get better at it, you're gonna feel better about yourself as you improve and improve and improve. Okay. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Now, in terms of other forms of engagement that Gen Z is doing, broadly speaking, which I say a lot, I'm sorry, their engagement with print-based media has declined significantly, right? So basically, it's not uncommon now, and it's a pretty strong majority of teenagers now, somewhere in about 2/3, that say they only read what's assigned for schoolwork, right? They're actually not doing a lot of reading outside of school. In the late 1970s, the majority of them, read books or magazines daily. Now again, there was less options, right? There were no smartphones, there was no internet. So, if you were going to be entertained in some ways, you didn't have as many options. I still had options, books or magazines. By 2015, only 16% of teenagers say they read books or magazines daily, by 2015, a third of high schoolers said they hadn't read a book for pleasure in the last year, right? So again, that still means 2/3 are doing so. It's not like a catastrophe, but it's still a significant number, basically who are not reading for pleasure. Newspaper reading has declined even further. Now, one of the things that's been noted is that, outside of certain communities in the US, particularly East Asian and Southeast Asian students, you've seen a precipitous decline in reading and writing scores on the SATs, right? So the SATs are the standardized tests. The standardized aptitude test is what it stands for. And basically everyone takes this in high school, and it's used as part of your college applications, right? So if you score high, you have a better chance of getting into a really great college, especially, the Ivies or the near Ivies. Those scores for reading and writing are considerably down across the board for American high schoolers. They're less proficient, and I mean, we can compare them, right? Because we have the scores from millennials and Gen X. Millennials and Gen X were kind of roughly on the same level, but Gen Z it's a significant kind of downward movement in terms of reading and writing. And they're consistently less proficient writers than millennials were at the same point. Sorry, I shouldn't have. My other cup has like rubber on the top that stops that from happening. And I'm a very fidgety person. So my wife says I have ADD or ADHD, and she wants to drug me, but I won't let her. It's not happening. Like, I've made it this far. I think I'm okay. They're less proficient writers. And this is like, if you talk to any professor, they'll say that students are terrible writers. They were saying that when I was in school, so I don't know if that counts. But that they're much less proficient at writing than they used to be back in the day. But in terms of writing scores on standardized testing, we have seen a decline for Gen Z. Okay, and this is kind of funny stat. I don't know if people were measuring this back in the day. Paying attention for a long time. This complaint gets put out a lot with Gen Z and how phones have affected our attention span. But in some studies, the average kind of was that Gen Z switches tasks about every 19 seconds, making it hard to have sustained attention on stuff. Okay. So we saw a kind of similar graph, when we were talking about mental health. This data, that one was updated, it went a little bit further because it had updated data from Monitoring the Future. But this is what's in iGen, right? The percentage of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders who get together with friends every day or nearly every day from Monitoring the Future, right, had declined about 10% a little bit less than 10%. If I'm reading that right, 50, oh no, 20%, sorry. A little bit, almost a quarter, almost 25%, sorry. So people are spending less time with each other, right? Less time on a daily basis. If we count the number of hours, right, we saw that on the mental health chart, right? The number of hours or minutes that young people spend together has been on a downward slope and really took a dive after 2012. So they're spending less time together than ever before. And I love this quote in iGen, right? People party because they're bored. They want something to do. Now we have Netflix. You can watch series nonstop. It's like I've been saying, it's not Netflix and chill, it's just Netflix. The options that you have at home now are so much greater that it sort of seems to have disincentivized going out, right? And doing stuff with other people. And it's been replaced, right, by screen time and interactions with peers through social media, you know, through gaming, right? And all of these sorts of things. And that's, you know, it seems to matter how you spend your time, right? Again, so all this data, it's kind of a short study period because they only really started asking certain questions relatively recently on monitoring the future. Like monitoring the future is, again, it's this big longitudinal study where basically every year they ask, you know, a kind of sample of young people, similar questions. They add questions to the survey over time to address and take some out to address social change. But basically, you know, they started asking, you know, questions about technology use in 2013. And so basically what we have on this chart is sort of basically a correlation analysis. This is, I think, using Pearson's R. And basically what you have here is either, you know, so when you're looking at correlation, you either have a perfect negative correlation of -1 or a perfect positive correlation of 1, and then a whole bunch of stuff in the middle. And what we see here basically is, you know, so on this side, negative correlation to risk of being unhappy, and on this side, a positive correlation, right? So I guess maybe I should grab my pen and do this so I'm not pointing up at the screen. I know you're all like, oh goody, the pen. But it's useful. I can just put it on laser pointer. Or I can circle stuff. Okay, so what do we have, right? So we're talking about, you know, what has a correlation or negative correlation with a risk of being unhappy based on how you spend your time. And obviously what you see at the bottom of the chart is our more, you know, kind of smartphone-y based activities, you know, texting, social networking websites, and internet use have pretty strong correlations, positive correlations to a risk of being unhappy, right? So anything kind of typically I would say over 0.2 or negative 0.2 is a strong correlation. And I mean, some of these are off the charts, right? So social network use and chance of being unhappy, like a 0.5, that's a really, really strong positive correlation with a risk of being unhappy, right? So the more you use social media, the higher the risk of being unhappy. Okay, and what has a negative correlation? Well, okay, so things we've always known are good for psychological health, right? Go back and read Aristotle, and Aristotle's recommending things like vigorous physical activity for the health of the mind. But sports and exercise, right? Having a pretty strong, and a little bit less than a 0.4 negative correlation to a risk of being unhappy, right? So it reduces your risk of being unhappy. And then religious service attendance, you know, relatively strong still. And then, you know, in-person social interaction and print media, both at what I would say is sort of like the borderline of a strong kind of correlation with, you know, in this case, a negative correlation with risk of being unhappy. So they're kind of on the lowish side, but still statistically significant. So, right, what you see, digital media and screen time tends to lead to a higher risk of being unhappy. Physical in-person interactions, you know, sports, exercise, religious services, and in-person social interactions tend to lead to, you know, less of a risk of being unhappy. Okay, yeah, so 56% of those who spent 10 hours a week online said they were unhappy, right? So big, heavy online media users tended to be unhappy. And 47% of those who spent 6 hours a week online said they were unhappy. So obviously, the more time you spend online, the worse the effects get, right? So pretty straightforward there. Okay, did I even let that load? I didn't, okay. So one very famous study, and one that she was talking about today when she put out her rebuttal to the Washington Post, Basically, oh, sorry, I'm actually talking about this Danish study. They've done a bunch of experiments now. Sorry, I should frame this because people are sort of wondering, what is the effects of social media, and does social media use really contribute to unhappiness, especially in teenagers? The Washington Post came out with what I think is a ridiculous editorial, basically saying we just don't have enough information. They might as well have put a post on there being like, this editorial paid for by Facebook, or whatever it is called, Meta. Ridiculous name. You trust a lizard person like Zuckerberg to come up with a ridiculous name for his company. Anyway, I don't care for Zuckerberg. He seems like a non-human. Anyway, the Washington Post was basically saying we don't have enough information to say whether social media use actually affects kind of happiness. And Twenge cites this particular study, which basically was a study done in, I want to say 2015, of 1,095 individuals, and basically half of them were asked to stop using Facebook and other social media. And they did this experiment. People who stopped using social media said they felt happier at the end of the process, right? And consistently through the process as well, because they were supposed to keep like a journal of their feelings. Those who still use social media saw no improvement. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear, right? And they've had studies, where people are asked to rate their happiness and how much they use Facebook. And this is back when Facebook was kind of the not the social media for old people, but everybody was using Facebook. They've repeated studies like this with Instagram, and basically heavier users said they were more likely to be unhappy than people who didn't use it at all. Okay, yeah, and obviously, so Gen Zers who visit social media sites every day are more likely to agree with the statements, "I often feel lonely, and I often wish I had more good friends." Okay, so what's on this chart, right? Kind of similar things, right? The relative risk of loneliness based on time spent on screen and non-screen activities. So I mean, what you see with the screen activities, right, is relatively weak correlations. 0.1 is not a super strong, actually I would say it's a weak correlation in terms of, risk of feeling lonely. But what you do see is pretty decent, negative correlations amongst these 10th graders who were surveyed, especially in sports, exercise, and in-person social contact. It reduces their risk of loneliness, right? So spending more time in person and being on a sports team or exercising tended to make people feel less lonely. Okay. Wait, what's the time? Oh, doing great on time. Okay. So, suicide risk, again, we don't see like a super strong negative correlation here, but kind of decent, right? So relative risk of having at least one suicide risk factor. Okay, so this is Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System. That's the CDC's study. Again, data taken from 2013 to 2015. And what you see, right, is sports and exercise tended to have a pretty decent negative correlation to risk of having one suicide risk factor, and especially compared to a lot of electronic device use, a pretty strong correlative effect with having at least one suicide risk factor. Electronic devices, right? Smartphones, tablets, video games, and computers. So pretty broad. Okay. Yeah. So the younger the teenager is, the more likely they are to have that social media use is going to correspond with depressive thoughts. So like a lot of other things, right? In terms of either legislation or rules, social rules around social media use, probably smart to kind of keep younger teens off social media for as long as possible, right? Kind of like alcohol. Oh my God, did I just compare? I just compared social media to drugs and alcohol. Okay, I can live with that comparison. Sorry. But yeah, like kind of drugs and alcohol, the later you can delay the use of social media in a young person's life, the less likely it is to affect them really deeply. Now, interesting thing that sort of kind of we've seen is that the risk seems to start with screen time, in excess of about 2 hours a day or more. Very high use, so beyond that, 5 hours plus. a day correlated to much higher risks of suicidality. But below 2 hours a day also seemed to have negative effects, right? There seemed to be kind of a sweet spot. Too much below 2 hours a day, and basically what you were finding, because so much social interaction for young people is mediated through social media, and in a sense, you can't belong if you don't have social media. You can't be interacting with your peers in some of the ways they interact. Below 2 hours a day was also kind of problematic because it made people feel like they were being left out all the time. Okay, so now the question always comes, and this is something that I know Jonathan and Jean have been working really hard against this perception, because one of the critiques that's often given of this kind of research on kind of negative mental health markers, whether it's suicide, self-harm, depression, anxiety, or whatever, and social media is, well, Gen Z is just much more open about these things than past generations were. So is it just a reporting difference? Now, neither Jonathan or Jean, and these are two of the experts in the field, tend to actually think that this is the case. We know, in terms of actual suicides and suicide attempts, especially that end in hospitalization, these things have been actually really carefully tracked for a long time, going back to basically the beginning of the 20th century. And beyond, if you're talking about the United States, governments keep track of suicides really carefully. So in terms of actual numbers of suicides, we know in very intimate detail how many suicides are committed every year in Canada, in Alberta, in the United States, and we have for a long time. So you can compare the statistics, honestly, going back to the 1800s. And we've seen a significant rise in actual suicides amongst teen girls, especially recently. But we also have been running, what we call benchmark studies for a long time, especially in the US. The US is so good at this, and I'm so jealous. And I want to transform everything. Please, if you have rich parents, have them give me a lot of money so I can do some of this research. But they've been running stuff like Monitoring the Future since the 70s, or the General Social Survey out of Newark, since the 1960s. And one of the things that they've done, or the high school transition survey, right, since I think this is the 80s. And some of the questions they've asked are always about mental health and depression, and asked in I think really, really clever ways to get at, do you feel lonely? Do you feel left out? You could look at the surveys. A lot of them will release the questions publicly, but a lot of these benchmark surveys, and again, or the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System from the CDC, have been asking mental health type questions for a long time. And we have good reason to believe that we have pretty good answers from all of these things. So Twenge and Haidt don't think that this is just a reporting thing, that now, Gen Z is so much more open about mental health questions. That's true, but it's also probably not what's driving these kind of statistical level changes, because we have good things to compare against from the past. And yeah, 46, and again, suicide we know so much about because we've been tracking it forever. 46% more 15 to 19-year-olds committed suicide in 2015 than 2007, right? So huge rises. And it's been going up, across the board, 2.5 times more in 12 to 14-year-olds, right? And even if we look at 10 to 14-year-olds, the number's risen significantly. And we've seen the rise, especially in girls, which is unusual, right? Girls have typically been more shielded from suicide and suicidality than males have, for lots of reasons. Okay. Did I miss a slide there? I did not. Oh, excuse me. Okay. Cyberbullying. Obviously, this is one of those things that has become a big concern as it relates to a lot of these electronic technologies, right? Digital technologies. Cyberbullying has been, I think, an emerging concern probably since social media became really pervasive. And it's different from in the past, right? One of the things we know, and I do think this is kind of interesting, 66% of those cyberbullied have at least one suicide risk factor. It's only 9% of those who are only bullied in person. So why? It's the pervasiveness of cyberbullying, right? Especially as we enter the smartphone era, right, past 2012. where if you were bullied at school, you went home or you went off to play hockey or to some kind of social activity, right? Whatever it is you did in your personal life that was outside of school, and that bullying for the most part went away, right? It was left in the past. It wasn't something you had to be concerned with in your hours outside of school. Yeah, your school hours might be hell, but you had a kind of safe space. What digital devices have done is sort of take away that safe space, right? Because the bullying will follow you into home, right? It follows you around. It enters your house. It wakes you up at 2 a.m. when you get a notification on social media of someone making fun of you on Instagram or whatever it is. That happens to be the way people are cyberbullied, DMs or whatever it happens to be, right? It's very much a kind of pervasive thing. So, and I think they mentioned it in that documentary, right? Human beings evolved because we're, as animals go, not that physically imposing, right? Our physical traits don't measure up terribly well to lions or tigers or wolves or any other kind of predators out in nature. So one of the ways that humans evolved and have been so successful is by cooperating. What this has done, however, is meant that belonging to the group is really, really important. And for whatever reason, from an evolutionary perspective, this is especially important for teenagers, right? We tend to think of teenagers as rebellious, but teenagers are actually brutal conformists, right? Any kind of deviation from social norms in teenagers is often punished relentlessly by peers, right? Because teenagers are in search of social acceptance. They want to find their in-group. They're biologically wired for it. And so, for human beings in general, social rejection is bad, right? Because if you were rejected by your tribe or your group back, when we were hunter-gatherers, being cast out meant you were going to get eaten by some much more imposing animal in relatively short order. So humans have evolved a powerful kind of aversion to social rejection. Now, basically we still have that same brain, right? We still have the brain of a hunter-gatherer. For millions, at least I guess, how old are modern humans? Maybe about 500,000 years old, roughly. So we still have, or is it 250,000? I can't remember. 250,000 years old. We still have this brain that craves, social attachment and reacts negatively to social rejection. Online, however, you can be socially rejected constantly, hundreds, thousands of times a day, and our brain just cannot deal with it, right? It is something that our human brain, which hasn't really evolved, in thousands of years, cannot really deal with being socially rejected on social media, especially as a teenager. It's much worse for teenagers. And that's why cyberbullying, right, when it follows you, when it's pervasive, when you can't get away from it, and you can't have even those moments of attachment at home that aren't disrupted by social rejection, it tends to be, really serious. Okay, so I think this is now a little bit old, but this is an article that came out in Time. This is Time. I often get stuff from The Atlantic, but this was Time. What was it? The secret language of girls on Instagram, and it talked about how this kind of plays out, right? How social acceptance or rejection plays out online for teen girls, right? So basically, they said there's 3 major ways that social media can be used in a kind of social way for girls on Instagram. So it could be used as a barometer for popularity, right? Tagging your friends, announcing that you posted a new photo of people, maybe tagging someone who's not even there just to say that you're their best friends, or having them in your Instagram bio, that this person is my bestie or whatever it happens to be, right? Okay, PDAs, right? Broken heart necklaces you gave to your besties, like that's all gone, right? You can still buy them at is it Ardennes or Claire's or whatever, the broken heart bestie necklace. But now all of the kind of signaling of who your best friend is for girls is on Instagram. A few lines at the top of your page to trumpet your inner circle, but all of that can be deleted and taken away, and people can be blocked or unfollowed, as a way to retaliate, or if you had a bad fight or something, right? So it can be a way to show affection or a way to show displeasure with people and a way to retaliate, right? You're angry at someone, don't tag the girl who's obviously in the picture, crop her out, refuse to follow back, whatever it happens to be, right? It's become a way, and there's kind of subtle ways that teenagers use, social media to kind of show what social status is. And all of this, becomes a form of social status, which I'm sure I don't have to tell you. You're all younger than me and lived through this, I'm sure. All right. Here's a clip. Again, I think this is from Cobra Kai. Actually, I know this is from Cobra Kai. Kind of what does cyberbullying look like? I thought this was a neat pop culture example of it. And her explanation of it's kind of neat too.
Just like a pig at a trough.
Can we get out of here, please?
Yeah. Wait for it.
My student tells me you've been harassed at school.
Yeah. Mostly online. I get mean texts and emails sent to me. Makes me not want to go.
And who sends you these messages?
Well, they're mostly anonymous. These kids create fake accounts. And they tell me things like I'm ugly and that I should kill myself.
Oh my God. What a bunch of pussies. Back in my day, if you wanted to tease someone, you did it to their face. There was honor, respect. These geeks hide behind their computers. What a bunch of spineless losers. You're not afraid of these losers, are you?
No?
You're gonna take shit from these losers?
No.
Good, because when I'm done with you, you're gonna be sending a message back. Only it's not gonna be with your keyboard. It's gonna be with your fists.
Okay, I love Johnny. He is the platonic form of toxic masculinity. Okay, a couple more slides there. I think what do I got? 32-ish slides. We're almost done, so I'll do a couple more and then we'll let you go for the day. Basically what we see here, right, in terms of, reverse hockey stick shaped graphs, some concerning ones, right? Percentage of 12th grade, all this taken from Monitoring the Future, right? This one from 1976 to 2015. So we had a long kind of trajectory here. And then from the other one, I often feel left out of things, or I feel lonely a lot for 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. But basically we have this great longitudinal data of what young people have been kind of saying for a long time through Monitoring the Future. And what we see, right, in terms of satisfied with their lives as a whole, it started at kind of a low ebb, back in the 1970s, here, and it was going well, and then it hits around 2012 and it just drops. And again, big drops like that in social science is really, really, really unusual, right? We don't tend to see big drops like that. We tend to see much more of the bumpy line thing, up and down, up and down. This one had been trending in a kind of positive direction for a long time, and then kind of took a sharp drop. And we see the same thing. So I would call that like a reverse hockey stick, right? Kind of like that. This one's more of a hockey stick shaped graph, kind of like that. I'm good at drawing, by the way. I'm very terrible. I still draw stick people, and sheeps are just like bubbles with 4 sticks coming out the bottom. My son asked me to draw a sheep, and he was very dissatisfied with the result. He's 3, and he still thinks my art sucks. Okay, but yeah, basically what we see in this other graph, right, feeling left out. Again, you get kind of around, this is around 2011, and you see, a trend that had been going in a good direction, fewer people feeling left out, then kind of jumps up. Same thing with often feel lonely, had been going in a good direction, and then sort of takes a jump in the other direction. So these are kind of negative trends, and Twenge and Haidt think this is very much related to smartphones and social media use. Okay. And yeah, I mean, I talked about this a little bit already. Girls seem to be more vulnerable to this than boys, which is why we've seen, larger scale effects, right? When we talk about percentages in all these kinds of negative markers, they're all bigger for females than males. Social media, more search for affirmation and then more chance for people to be cruel, body shaming, slut shaming, and therefore we see, bigger rises in self-injury, hospitalization due to self-injury, non-fatal, and suicide attempts are all there. And yeah, this is an interesting quote, from a doctor at Bellevue Hospital, a psychiatrist, that every single week they have girls who come into the ER after a social media rumor or incident upset them, right, and they react by harming themselves. Or we saw those numbers out of Australia. Self-poisonings, all sorts of things that people are doing. Most of it is cutting, right? But increasingly we're seeing more and more worrying kind of self-harm behaviors and things like suicide attempts. And yeah, this is a good number, between 2011 and 2016, 30% more college students said they intentionally injured themselves. And we saw those charts when we were talking about mental health, right? The climbing in self-harming is good English. The rise in self-harming behavior, especially amongst girls, but in boys as well, is really troubling. Okay, one of the culprits here with a lot of this in terms of declining mental health is probably around sleep. Now, I think it should surprise no one that teenagers sleep a lot or want to sleep a lot. It's actually, I shouldn't have told my daughter this because she uses it against me all the time. The teenage brain actually needs to sleep a lot, right? It's actually, the teenage brain is undergoing really intense changes, right? As you go from a child's brain to an adult brain. It's one of, outside of those kind of that first year of when they're first born, adolescence is a time where your brain, goes through a tremendous amount of change, right? It ends up interacting with with sex hormones in major ways, going through puberty. This is no fun at all, I think. And one of the results is teenagers actually need a lot of sleep, right? More sleep than adults, and certainly, more than they needed at 10 years old. So what do we see in terms of, actual sleep? 50% more teens were sleep deprived in 2015 than 1991, and 22% more teens failed to get 7 hours of sleep in 2015 compared to 2012. And I mean, this seems to be related by all accounts to the fact, if we go back to talking about what they do with their smartphones are in the bedroom, right? And notifications are coming in at all hours of the night. Yeah, you can put it on Do Not Disturb, and some students tell me that's what they do. But it seems to be, especially for those teens who are insecure and looking for affirmation and can't disconnect, checking social media at all times of night does seem to be biting into people's sleep schedules, making it harder for people to sleep. We know the effect of blue light on sleep, and the smartphone makers have all put in those blue light filter where your screen turns an annoying shade of yellow. I actually don't know how scientifically sound that is, but we've seen a decline in the amount of sleep that young people are getting. And this, if you sleep deprive someone, hey, it's a method of torture for a reason, right? If you got stuck in Guantanamo Bay, or someone was interrogating you and trying to get you to crack, one of the things they do is deprive you of sleep. Well, it seems like in some ways, teenagers are depriving themselves of sleep, and you get those knock-on effects of depression and all that stuff. Okay, so I won't play the video. You can play the video if you want, but we're almost done. Okay, so could it be something else? I mean, Twenge really doesn't think so, and I know as she's collaborated with Jonathan Haidt, he doesn't think so either. One of the big things, right, is that we see so many of the markers, right? And again, if you look back at those slides that I showed you on mental health, those all come from Haidt and Twenge, but they all have that bright line on 2012 where things really jump, right? You tend to see big changes after 2012. Usually, if you're going to have a big change, like a hockey stick shaped kind of change, typically there's a big social phenomenon that's happened, right? And the fact that smartphones went from essentially, we talk about who had them in the population, like in 2007, it was almost nobody, right? It was like business executives had their Blackberries. And then from 2007 to 2012, it went to being basically a ubiquitous phenomenon, right? Senior citizens had them. My dad had them. My dad and mom had them. And teenagers, basically 3/4 of them, and 94% of emerging adults had smartphones. So that big change corresponds really closely with the big change in mental health markers, increased screen time and all that came with smartphones. So Twenge really, and the linked decline in in-person social interaction. And Twenge really thinks that nothing else corresponds quite so neatly with those changes. I mean, there are people that disagree with her, but I think the case is pretty strong. Okay, so her advice, I won't play the video, it's kind of cheesy, but you can play it for yourself if you want. Sunlight, in-person interaction, and sleep all help reduce depression, right? So she suggests all of those things. And basically they are all things that our ancient ancestors did, right? They were outside, they were with people all the time. That's where our brains evolved. So we need to, feed that evolved part of our brain. So she suggests, people need to go outside, exercise, see people, and sleep at night, and spend far less time on smartphones. Okay, so that takes us through Twenge. We'll pick up our last unit on Sherry Turkle's Reclaiming Conversation on Wednesday. We should finish that in no time. And then we'll have time for some practice questions, and then the course is done. So you've made it through everything but the last class. All right, we'll see you on Wednesday.